We're going to wrap up Chapter 9 today and decide which audit approach we're going to take. First, we're going to talk about private companies not covered by Sarbanes-Oxley. After evaluating the design of the controls, you do not believe their controls would prevent or detect and correct misstatements. You believe the controls are ineffective. You preliminarily assess control risk is high, and you're going to take a primarily substantive audit approach. If you believe that substantive tests cost less than tested controls, that won't change anything. That's really kind of what you're hoping for. We always evaluate the design of the controls. For private companies, if we're taking a primarily substantive approach, we do not have to test the operating effectiveness of the controls. We always do analytical procedures because they're cheap, not very costly, and we're going to do extensive substantive tests. One or the other has to be extensive, either the tested controls or substantive tests. After evaluating the design of the controls, you believe the controls would prevent or detect. You believe the controls would be effective if properly implemented. You preliminarily assess control risk is low, and you're going to take a reduced level of control risk approach, or LOC, reduced level of control risk approach. You believe it would cost less to perform tested controls than substantive tests. That's what you're hoping for. So that's not going to change my audit approach. Always evaluate the design. If we're taking a reduced level of control risk approach, we're going to perform extensive tested controls. Analytical procedures, I'm always going to do because they're cheap. Auditing standards require that we always perform some substantive test. So we're going to perform limited substantive test. Notice the words limited and extensive. After evaluating the design of the controls, you believe the client's controls would prevent or detect. You believe the controls would be effective if properly implemented. But now you believe substantive tests cost less than tested controls. You'll take a primarily substantive audit approach even though you believe their controls would be effective. Okay. Always evaluate the design. No tested controls, analytical procedures, and extensive test of account balances. Okay, so if we pretend auditing standards require us audit risk to be less than or equal to 5%, they don't, but let's just pretend for a minute. And if we let inherent risk equal 1, then we can achieve our objective either if control risk is 0.05 or if we reduce detection risk to 0.05. Either one will satisfy auditing standards. So we're going to take whichever one is cheaper. Okay, for private companies, if the controls are ineffective, then we have no choice but to assess control risk is high or max and perform extensive substantive test. If we believe that the controls are effective, and if we believe performing tested controls will be cheaper, we can take a reduced level of control risk approach, perform extensive tested controls, and limit our substantive test. If the controls are effective but we believe substantive test would cost less, then we can take a primarily substantive approach, not test any controls, and perform extensive substantive test. For private companies, we always have to understand the internal controls, document our understanding, evaluate the design of the controls. preliminarily assess control risk, document our preliminary assessment of control risk. If control risk is low and we test the controls would cost less than substantive test, we'll design and perform tested controls, document the results of our tested controls, design and perform limited substantive test, and document the results of our substantive test. If controls are ineffective or we believe substantive test costs less than tested controls for private companies, we're going to skip the internal tested controls and design and perform extensive substantive tests and document our results. For public companies covered by Sarbanes-Oxley, companies that have to file with the Securities Exchange Commission, after evaluating the design of the controls you believe the client's controls would prevent or detect and correct, you believe they would be effective if properly implemented. You preliminarily assess control risk is low. You'll take a reduced level of control risk approach. You believe it would cost less to perform tested controls. Good, that's what we're hoping for. Won't change my audit approach. We always evaluate. We do extensive tested controls, do analytical procedures because they're cheap, and perform limited substantive tests because we're always required to perform substantive tests. Change the scenario. After evaluating the design of the controls you do not believe they would prevent or detect, you believe the controls are ineffective. You preliminarily assess control risk is high. You're going to take a primarily substantive approach. Substantive test costs less than tested controls. Won't change. I'm not sure that's relevant for public companies, but let's walk through. Going to evaluate the design always. I need to do some tested controls. With a public company, I need to issue a report on the effectiveness of their controls. It's going to take some evidence. We can't just say their controls are not effective. We're going to need some evidence that their controls are not effective. The company's probably going to push back. They don't want us to say their controls are not effective. So always have to get some evidence. I believe it probably takes less evidence to prove controls are ineffective than it does to prove they're effective. If I find one material misstatement, I know their controls are ineffective. Always do analytical procedures. Because their controls are not effective, I have to perform extensive substantive testing. For public companies, if their controls are effective, I'm going to take a reduced level of control risk approach regardless of the cost. We have to issue a report regarding the effectiveness of their controls. Every company is going to prefer that we issue a report that says their controls are effective. In order to do that, we need to perform tested controls to get evidence that their controls are effective. The CEO and CFO are more than willing to pay more, even if the audit's more expensive than a primarily substantive approach. They want that opinion on that their controls are effective. If their controls are effective, we're going to take a primarily substantive approach. For public companies, we're always going to do some tested controls because we need evidence that their controls are not effective. Because their controls are not effective, we'll have to perform extensive substantive tests. For a public company, we have to understand the internal controls, document our understanding, evaluate the design of the internal controls, design and perform tested controls always, document the results of those tested controls and our final control risk assessment, If control risk is greater than low, then we're going to have to perform extensive substantive tests and document the results. If the controls are effective, we can limit our substantive test. We document those results. Thank you and have a good evening.